Coffee is a beverage prepared from roasted coffee beans. Seeds of the coffea plant's fruits are separated to produce unroasted green coffee beans. The beans are roasted and then ground into fine particles that are typically steeped in hot water before being filtered out, producing a cup of coffee. By the 16th century, the drink had reached the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, later spreading to Europe. In the 20th century, coffee became a global commodity, creating different coffee cultures around the world. As of 2018, update, Brazil was the leading grower of coffee beans, producing 35% of the world's total. Despite sales of coffee reaching billions of dollars worldwide, farmers producing coffee beans disproportionately live in poverty. Critics of the coffee industry have also pointed to its negative impact on the environment and the clearing of land for coffee growing and water use. According to Captain Haynes, who was the colonial administrator of Aden, 1839 to 1854, Mocha historically imported up to two-thirds of their coffee from Berbera-based merchants before the coffee trade of Mocha was captured by British-controlled Aden in the 19th century. The thriving trade between Venice and North Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East, back then Ottoman Empire, brought many goods, including coffee, to the Venetian port. When coffee reached North America during the colonial period, it was initially not as successful as it had been in Europe, as alcoholic beverages remained more popular. During the 18th century, coffee consumption declined in Britain, giving way to tea drinking. The Frenchman Gabriel de Clieu took a coffee plant to the French territory of Martinique in the Caribbean in the 1720s, 31, from which much of the world's cultivated Arabica coffee is descended. Cultivation was taken up by many countries in Central America in the latter half of the 19th century, and almost all involved the large-scale displacement and exploitation of the indigenous people. Over 100 million people in developing countries have become dependent on coffee as their primary source of income. Several species of shrub of the genus Coffea produce the berries from which coffee is extracted. The two main species commercially cultivated are Coffea canephora, predominantly a form known as Robusta, and C. Coffea arabica is predominantly self-pollinating, and as a result, the seedlings are generally uniform and vary little from their parents. The traditional method of planting coffee is to place 20 seeds in each hole at the beginning of the rainy season. A more effective process of growing coffee, used in Brazil, is to raise seedlings in nurseries that are then planted outside after 6 to 12 months. Of the two main species grown, Arabica coffee arabica is generally more highly regarded than Robusta coffee. Robusta coffee tends to be bitter and has less flavor but a better body than Arabica. Good quality Robusta beans are used in traditional Italian espresso blends to provide a full-bodied taste and a better foam head, known as crema. Himalaya vastatrix is a fungal pathogen, 59, and results in light, rust-colored spots on the undersides of coffee plant leaves. Messina citricolor, commonly referred to as American leaf spot, is a fungus that can affect the whole coffee plant. The 2 mm long coffee borer beetle, Hypothenemus hampei, is the most damaging insect pest to the world's coffee industry, destroying up to 50% or more of the coffee berries on plantations in most coffee-producing countries. Starting in the 1970s, many farmers switched their production method to sun cultivation, in which coffee is grown in rows under full sun with little or no forest canopy. Coffee production uses a large volume of water. On average, it takes about 140 liters, 37 US gal, of water to grow the coffee beans needed to produce 1 cup of coffee. More commonly, crops are strip-picked, where all berries are harvested simultaneously regardless of ripeness by person or machine. Then they are sorted by ripeness and color, and most often the flesh of the berry is removed, usually by machine, and the seeds are fermented to remove the slimy layer of mucilage still present on the seed. When the fermentation is finished, the seeds are washed with large quantities of fresh water to remove the fermentation residue, which generates massive amounts of coffee wastewater. In this method, the pulped and fermented coffee is spread thinly on raised beds, which allows the air to pass on all sides of the coffee, and then the coffee is mixed by hand. An Asian coffee known as Kopi Luwak undergoes a peculiar process made from coffee berries eaten by the Asian palm civet, passing through its digestive tract, with the beans eventually harvested from feces. The next step in the process is the roasting of green coffee. Coffee is usually sold in a roasted state, and with rare exceptions, such as infusions from green coffee beans, 94, coffee is roasted before it is consumed. Depending on the color of the roasted beans as perceived by the human eye, they will be labeled as light, medium, medium dark, dark, or very dark. This elaborate light meter uses a process known as spectroscopy to return a number that consistently indicates the roasted coffee's relative degree of roast or flavor development. The degree of roast affects coffee flavor and body. The roasted coffee was packed and then 99% of the air was removed, allowing the coffee to be stored indefinitely until the can was opened. Coffee beans must be ground and brewed to create a beverage. Almost all methods of preparing coffee require that the beans be ground and then mixed with hot water long enough to allow the flavor to emerge but not so long as to draw out bitter compounds. Brewing considerations include the fineness of the grind, how the water is used to extract the flavor, the ratio of coffee grounds to water, the brew ratio, additional flavorings such as sugar, milk, and spices, and the technique to be used to separate spent grounds. Coffee beans may be ground in various ways. Brewing coffee by boiling was the earliest method, and Turkish coffee is an example of this method. It is prepared by grinding or pounding the seeds to a fine powder, then adding it to water and bringing it to a boil for no more than an instant in a pot called a sezvi or, in Greek, a empriki, briki, from Turkish ibrek. In an automatic coffee maker, hot water drips onto coffee grounds that are held in a paper, plastic, or perforated metal coffee filter, allowing the water to seep through the ground coffee while extracting its oils and essences. In a coffee percolator, water is pulled under a pipe by gravity, which is then forced into a chamber above a filter by steam pressure created by boiling. The water then seeps through the grounds, and the process is repeated until terminated by removing from the heat, by an internal timer, 114, or by a thermostat that turns off the heater when the entire pot reaches a certain temperature. Once brewed, coffee may be served in a variety of ways. Drip brewed, percolated, or French pressed cafetiere coffee may be served as white coffee with a dairy product such as milk or cream, or dairy substitute, or as black coffee with no such addition. In its most basic form, an espresso is served alone as a shot or short black, or with hot water added, when it is known as café americano. Coffee can also be incorporated with alcohol to produce a variety of beverages. It is combined with whiskey and Irish coffee, and it forms the base of alcoholic coffee liqueurs such as Kahlua and Tia Maria. Many products are sold for the convenience of consumers who do not want to prepare their coffee or who do not have access to coffee-making equipment. Canned coffee has been popular in Asian countries for many years, particularly in China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Vending machines typically sell varieties of flavored canned coffee, much like brewed or percolated coffee, available both hot and cold. Japanese convenience stores and groceries also have a wide availability of bottled coffee drinks, which are typically lightly sweetened and pre-blended with milk. Liquid coffee concentrates are sometimes used in large institutional situations where coffee needs to be produced for thousands of people at the same time. It is described as having a flavor about as good as low-grade Robusta coffee and costs about 10 cents a cup to produce. Over 90% of coffee production takes place in developing countries, mainly South America, while consumption happens primarily in industrialized economies. Since the beginning of the 20th century, annual world production has grown to over 100 million bags, which corresponds to 6 to 7 million tons, whereas in 1825 only 100,000 tons were produced. Statistical data on world agricultural coffee production differs slightly depending on whether it comes from the FAO or the ICO. Beyond the occasional overproduction crises and inventory differences, the volumes produced, traded, and consumed are following an upward trend. Coffee is bought and sold as green coffee beans by roasters, investors, and price speculators as a tradable commodity in commodity markets and exchange-traded funds. The production yield of coffee increases. The gains made by this trade allow sustained economic growth in the country. The gains made by this trade allow sustained economic growth. The 4 years between planting a coffee and the first harvest extend seasonal variations in the price of coffee. On average, 46% of European consumers claim to be willing to pay substantially more for ethical products, including fair trade products such as coffee. Some estates known for high-quality coffee also sell their coffee through an online auction. Polyphenol levels vary depending on how beans are roasted as well as for how long. A 2017 review of clinical trials found that drinking coffee is generally safe within usual levels of intake and is more likely to improve health outcomes than to cause harm at doses of 3 or 4 cups of coffee daily. Widely known as coffee houses or cafes, establishments serving prepared coffee or other hot beverages have existed for over 500 years.